00030 hours. The night stretched like black velvet across Omaha Beach, and Heinrich Seo's bunker felt smaller than ever. His eyes darted across the dimly lit embrasures, tracing the silhouettes of barbed wire and hidden obstacles, each one a silent promise of death. The Atlantic Wall wasn't just concrete and steel, it was a monument to their hubris. Every bunker, pillbox, and machine gun nest built to make the Allies choke before even reaching sand. Seo remembered Field Marshal RML's words 3 days ago, echoing in his mind. When they come, this beach will be their cemetery. Back then, it had sounded like a challenge, a gauntlet thrown with confidence. Now, alone in the shadowed bunker, it felt like a curse. The cold bit through his uniform, and the distant roar of waves was broken only by the occasional thump of an artillery shell landing offshore. Seo's fingers brushed the metal of the MG-42. 13,500 rounds, he would later recall. But tonight, ammo seemed meaningless. Each second stretched. Every gust of wind whispered the coming chaos. The crumpled letter from Metzingen weighed heavy in his pocket. Not just paper, but hope, fear, and a reminder that someone somewhere expected him to survive. The weight of expectation, both from his country and a girl who loved him, made his chest tighten. Across the horizon, tiny flashes began to flicker, shadows on the water, small and distant. Paratroopers? Gliders? Dunny units, maybe. The German soldiers had seen plenty of Allied deception in the past, but tonight felt different. There was a rhythm to the flashes, an almost deliberate pulse, like a heartbeat counting down the seconds until hell would break loose. Major Hans von Luck's voice crackled faintly over the radio, commanding patience, but Seo's gut twisted. Every instinct screamed movement, but the orders were clear: hold until clarified. Holding meant nothing when the unknown pressed closer. Seo thought of his comrades, some seasoned, some barely 20, all swept into a storm they couldn't yet see. The night was eerily serene, a cruel calm before the storm. Somewhere behind the cliffs, artillery crews checked their guns, men brushed hands over sandbags, and officers murmured plans. Every division, every position, every preparation was about to collide with a force they had no hope of stopping. The Atlantic Wall, the mighty fortress, stretched endlessly along the coast, but even its formidable defenses were blind to the scale of what was coming. The first waves of gliders and paratroopers would land in the east and west, some missing their targets by miles. Confusion was already seeding itself in German ranks. Seo gripped his rifle tighter. He could hear his own breath, shallow and fast, echoing in the bunker. His mind wandered to Metzingen again, to a world that would continue after this night, a world he might never see. And then came the first distant booms, the naval bombardment. At first muted, then growing in force and fury. Every shot a reminder that the Atlantic was no longer calm, that the invasion wasn't a story to be written tomorrow, it was happening now. Seo's MG-42 rested ready, metal gleaming faintly in the moonlight, the cold steel, a friend and a curse. He imagined the men coming, thousands, armored, relentless. The defensive calculations of Colonel Ernst Goth, the endless concrete, the obstacles. They had all assumed limited assault, disciplined waves, a controlled attack. This wasn't that. This was chaos multiplied, a tidal wave of humanity and steel that the Atlantic Wall could not contain. And yet, Seo's hands did not shake, not yet. Fear existed, but so did duty, and a soldier's stubborn will to fight. Tonight, he would fire until his hands bled, until the barrels melted, until hope ran out. The first distant shadows began moving toward the beach, faint against the gray horizon. The glint of bayonets, the hum of engines, the whisper of waves crashing over hidden obstacles. They came. The world Seo knew, the world he believed would last, was about to be consumed by fire, noise, and the unrelenting machinery of war. And all he could do was wait, watch, and pray that when dawn broke, he would still be there to see it.
05:30 a.m. Dawn bled slowly into the horizon, pale and fragile, struggling against the smoke and chaos already settling over Omaha Beach. The first hints of movement became clearer, tiny silhouettes of landing craft, shadows crawling over the surf. Heinrich Sau pressed his face to the embrasure, eyes narrowing through the gloom. The sea that had seemed calm hours ago was now alive with the dark shapes of the invasion fleet. Ships, landing craft, and destroyers stretched as far as the eye could see, a gray metallic carpet inching relentlessly toward the shore. His stomach nodded. This was no rehearsal. This was the real deal. The first naval guns spoke, distant booms growing steadily louder. USS Texas and its brethren hammered the coastline, sending shudders through the Atlantic wall. The concrete around Sau groaned and cracked, dust raining over him. He swallowed hard, realizing with a sickening clarity that the fortress they had trusted, the Atlantic wall, was not invincible. Behind him, fellow soldiers clutched rifles, their faces pale in the shifting light, muttering prayers or swearing in low, tight voices. Orders crackled over the radios, but confusion reigned. Reports contradicted each other. Paratroopers in the east, gliders in the west, dummy troops with firecrackers exploding in the distance. Chaos had a rhythm of its own, and the German defenses were dancing to someone else's drum. Sau's MG-42 thundered for the first time at 06:35 a.m. The recoil bit into his shoulders as he fired short bursts, tracking the advancing waves of soldiers with deadly precision. Smoke and salt spray mingled in the air, every breath tasting of gunpowder. He imagined the Americans as they had imagined him, indomitable, precise, and merciless. Each trigger squeeze was a scream, a desperate attempt to slow the unstoppable tide. Yet for every man he felled, dozens more pressed forward, endless, unrelenting. Material shock began to settle over the German defenders. The realization that no matter how fiercely they fought, ammunition was finite, courage was finite, but the enemy's resources were infinite. The artillery behind the bunkers sputtered, firing calculated bursts meant to thin the approaching waves, but the American bombardment was relentless. Ships fired hundreds of shells at single targets, each impact shaking the sandbags and concrete like thunder. Men were thrown to the ground, dust and debris coating their eyes, mouths, lungs. Sau glanced over the horizon and saw the horizon alive with smoke, metal, and flame. Destroyed landing craft floating like broken toys in the surf. And yet, more kept coming. Each wave replaced the last with terrifying efficiency. Orders from division headquarters trickled down, hold positions, wait for clarification. The rigid chain of command that had always been the German army's backbone now seemed like a noose. Decisions delayed, counterattacks postponed. Panic whispered in the ears of the soldiers who were expected to resist an impossible force. Von Luck's warnings from earlier in the night replayed in Sau's mind. Every minute we wait gives them time to consolidate. Every minute felt like an eternity, and the consolidation was visible. The landing craft forming cohesive assault lines, paratroopers marking the flanks, gliders dropping reinforcements behind the coast. By mid-morning, Sau's bunker had become a maelstrom. Men shouted coordinates, signals, and warnings. Shells screamed overhead. Explosions rattled the walls. He fired, reloaded, fired again, each burst leaving the barrel red-hot, every magazine emptied faster than they could be replaced. Behind him, ammunition piles dwindled. The calculations that promised days of defensive capacity evaporated in hours. The psychological toll was crushing. Men froze, shaking, swearing, some weeping, others laughing with the madness creeping in. The Atlantic Wall, once a symbol of German might, had become a monument to the futility of resistance. Sau's thoughts flickered back to Metzingen, to the letter that had promised hope beyond the horizon. The words now felt cruel, distant, and meaningless against the ocean of human firepower pressing him backward. The realization sank in. Courage alone would not save them.
They were witnesses, not masters of a force that had turned war into a precise industrial equation. Tanks, planes, supplies, reinforcements, all moving with mechanical inevitability. And all Cao could do was fire, wait, and survive. From the cliffs, artillery observers reported endless American waves moving inland, establishing footholds and clearing obstacles with machines Cao had never imagined. Flails, flame tanks, bridging equipment. The beach he had prepared to defend was melting under the assault. By 1200 hours, German ammunition stores were nearly exhausted, bunkers were damaged, and men were beginning to break. And still, the Americans advanced, a living wall of industrial warfare. Cao fired until hands blistered, eyes burned, and the bunker itself seemed to moan under the sheer pressure of destruction. He counted nothing now. Numbers lost meaning. Survival, motion, and instinct governed every decision. The horizon, once a calm expanse of water, now represented the totality of human ingenuity against him, a reminder that this invasion was not a battle of bravery, but of production, planning, and overwhelming force. And as he reloaded again, he knew one truth. By the end of this day, Omaha Beach would tell a story not of heroism alone, but of a tide that could not be stopped, no matter how many barrels roared defiance into the dawn.
0900 hours. The sun had risen fully, pale and merciless, casting Omaha Beach in stark light. Heinrich Sue's bunker, once a haven of relative security, now felt like a tomb. Dust, smoke, and the acrid stench of gunpowder filled every corner. Around him, fellow soldiers were shell-shocked, some muttering incomprehensible curses, others staring blankly at the horizon, where American soldiers, gliders, and tanks continued to pour onto the sand. The Atlantic Wall was failing, slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, then with a sudden, merciless acceleration. Each bunker, each obstacle, each plan they had spent months preparing was being torn apart by sheer force and relentless coordination. Sue's MG-42 barked continuously. He had lost count of how many rounds he'd fired, but the barrel was glowing red-hot, the recoil sending jolts of pain up his arms. Each short burst sent bodies falling in the sand, but for every one down, 3 more took their place. The concept of victory seemed almost laughable now, a cruel joke whispered by the wind that carried the distant screams and explosions from the shore. In moments of grim clarity, he realized the German calculations had failed catastrophically. Ammunition, men, artillery, they had been prepared for a controlled assault, not an industrial machine of war designed to grind them into dust. From the cliffs, officers shouted orders, but the chain of command had disintegrated. Paratroopers had landed far behind German lines, cutting communications and scattering reinforcements. Supply routes that were supposed to bring ammunition, medical aid, and reserves were already compromised, turning the Atlantic Wall into a static prison. Every attempt to organize a counterattack was met with confusion and failure. Units fired at shadows, at flares, even at their own men in the panic and chaos of the battlefield. Sue's thoughts flickered to human absurdity. How had they believed this beach could be held? How could concrete, steel, and calculated fields of fire withstand a force that replaced losses faster than men could fall? He remembered RML inspecting the positions, nodding with satisfaction. "This will be their cemetery," he had said. The cemetery was indeed being written, but not for the Allies. It was for the illusions of German invincibility. The first armored units attempted to respond. The 21st Panzer Division moved toward the coast, tanks clanking over destroyed roads, artillery firing at the advancing Americans. Yet every movement was visible, illuminated by parachute flares, guided by aerial reconnaissance. German armor met a storm of anti-tank fire and naval bombardment. Tanks went down in minutes, their crews trapped by flames and smoke. In that moment, the battlefield became a surreal theater. Shadows of death dancing against smoke, explosions painting a hellish tableau on the sand. Sue kept firing. His hands bled, his eyes stung. He knew comrades were falling around him, yet the line of Americans seemed endless, their waves never breaking, advancing methodically, almost mechanically. It was as if the ocean itself had joined the assault, relentless and inexorable. Psychological shock had set in fully now. Material shock, the total impossibility of resisting this tide, gnawed at every soldier. Orders were meaningless, courage was meaningless, only instinct remained, and the machine gun was an extension of it, teeth against an unstoppable force. Behind the chaos, Sue glimpsed the ingenuity of the Allies. Specialized armor, Hobart's funnies moved to clear mines, flamethrowers shot tongues of fire, bridging tanks created paths over obstacles, and tanks advanced over bunkers like unstoppable predators. The beach became a chessboard where the German pieces had been replaced with fragile shadows, incapable of stopping a tide that had long since become overwhelming. Sue's eyes strayed to the crumpled letter in his pocket. Metzingen's words were now almost unreal, a symbol of a world untouched by this industrial slaughterhouse. Every word of promise, every sentiment of waiting collided with the reality of the battlefield. He understood fully that no single act of heroism could alter the mathematics of this war. Bravery was consumed as quickly as ammunition, skill was devoured by sheer numbers, and production, American production, was the true weapon. By late morning, German defenses were fractured, their bunkers damaged, and morale nearly extinct. The few remaining artillery positions fired in desperation, but ammunition was rationed like treasure. The psychological weight of seeing endless waves of enemy soldiers, tanks, and ships was crushing. They had been trained to repel invaders, to hold the line at all costs, yet the cost was now being paid in full, measured not just in blood, but in shattered illusions and broken minds. Sue fired until exhaustion threatened to take him, yet he could not stop. The MG-42 had become both savior and executioner, a lifeline amidst the carnage and a testament to feudal defiance. He glimpsed a friend fall nearby, lifeless in the sand, a silent reminder that each heartbeat was borrowed and every second might be the last. Omaha Beach was no longer a defensive position. It was a crucible, forging despair and revelation in equal measure. By noon, the first clear footholds had been established by American forces. Paratroopers, gliders, tanks, and infantry moved with lethal precision. Sue's world, once rigid and calculated, had been reduced to a tableau of destruction, human and structural. The Atlantic Wall, once a symbol of power, now groaned under the assault, and the soldier within it understood with grim clarity. The war had become a contest of production, logistics, and relentless force. Courage alone could not stop it, and the tide had only just begun.
1,300 hours. The sun hung high, relentless and unforgiving, baking the sand into a blistering expanse of chaos. Heinrich See's bunker, once a calculated haven, now felt like a coffin perched on the edge of a maelstrom. Through the shattered embrasures, he watched the beach transform into a nightmare of iron, smoke, and unending motion. The first waves of assault troops had reached the sand, overcoming obstacles and mines with a brutal efficiency that made the German defensive calculations laughable. Every fallen soldier seemed to be replaced instantly, a living tide pushing forward with mechanical precision. See fired in short bursts, MG-42 barking like a predator in the storm. The recoil sent jolts up his arms, yet he could not stop. Each man who fell to his fire was immediately replaced. The chaos was total. Smoke from shells, burning landing craft, and flamethrowers mingled with the salty spray of the Atlantic, creating a suffocating haze that clung to everything. Screams, shouts, and the relentless thump of artillery created a symphony of madness. The Atlantic Wall, once a symbol of invincibility, now groaned and cracked under the ceaseless onslaught. German officers shouted orders, but communication had disintegrated. Paratroopers behind the lines were cutting supply routes and telephone lines. Reserves attempted to maneuver, but Allied air superiority made every movement visible, every road a potential death trap. Tanks of the 21st Panzer Division moved slowly toward the shore, but flares and relentless naval fire turned their advance into a slaughter. The technological edge of the Allies was crushing, every move of the defenders countered with surgical precision. C's thoughts flickered to Metzingen, to the crumpled letter that had seemed a tether to life, to hope, to a world outside this inferno. Now it felt almost cruelly irrelevant. The promise of waiting, of reunion, was drowned beneath the tidal wave of mechanized, industrialized war. Human courage, skill, and discipline were being devoured by sheer numbers and logistical supremacy. Every breath was a battle, every heartbeat a countdown to potential death. By mid-afternoon, the Germans were beginning to fracture mentally. Material shock had fully taken hold. Bunkers that were supposed to withstand artillery now cracked. Men huddled in fear or fired wildly at shadows. Every attempt to coordinate was met with confusion or delay. Orders from higher command were almost useless. The chain of command had been rendered irrelevant by the scale and sophistication of the Allied assault. C saw tanks and specialized armor advancing, clearing mines, crushing obstacles, and creating paths for the infantry. Every barricade was neutralized, every defensive calculation undone. The beach, once a controlled killing field, was now a chaotic tableau where the defenders were increasingly irrelevant. Ammunition ran low, radios failed, and the men were exhausted, physically and mentally. Yet C continued to fire, MG-42 barking in short bursts, a desperate attempt to reclaim control over a battlefield that had long since outgrown him. By 1600 hours, the first real counterattacks were attempted. The 21st Panzer Division tried to press toward the coast, moving through the chaos with armored columns. Yet Allied air power and artillery made the effort almost suicidal. Every tank was illuminated by flares, every movement mapped by intelligence. As C watched, one after another German tank was knocked out, crews trapped inside or fleeing under fire. The illusion of control, of competence, of strategic dominance dissolved entirely. C's hands were blistered, his vision blurred from smoke and fatigue, yet he held the MG-42, the only constant in a world gone mad. He fired at anything moving, desperately trying to slow the tide of men, machines, and fire rolling inexorably toward him. The beach had become a crucible, a place where training, bravery, and discipline were consumed by the sheer mathematics of modern warfare. The industrial might of the Allies was a force he could neither resist nor comprehend fully. As night approached, C glanced across the horizon. Supply ships, landing craft, and reinforcements continued to arrive. Paratroopers consolidated their positions inland. The German defenders, despite heroic efforts, were physically and psychologically overwhelmed. The Atlantic Wall had become not a barrier, but a monument to human miscalculation. C's bunker, scarred by shell fire and echoes of screams, was now a relic of a defense that had long since disappeared. In the fading light, C finally allowed himself a grim realization. Survival was no longer about skill, courage, or preparation. It was about enduring, moment by moment, amidst a force that was as mechanical as it was relentless. The Americans had turned warfare into an industrial machine, a process of production, movement, and inexorable efficiency. And he, along with every other soldier on Omaha Beach, was caught in the gears, a cog in a machine far larger than any man could resist.
1800 hours. The sun had dipped low, but Omaha Beach was still burning with chaos. Heinrich Sau's bunker now reeked of sweat, smoke, and gunpowder. The MG-42 rested heavily in his hands, metal scorching, recoil jarring every joint. Around him, the remnants of his comrades were scattered, some crouched behind shattered sandbags, others lying unmoving in the sand. The Atlantic Wall, once a fortress of confidence, now looked more like a graveyard than a defensive line. Every calculation, every strategy, every ounce of preparation had been obliterated by sheer force and relentless efficiency. Sau's eyes scanned the horizon. American soldiers had established multiple footholds, advancing with an almost mechanical precision.
Paratroopers who had landed hours earlier now coordinated flanking maneuvers, cutting off any hope of German reinforcement. Tanks rumbled across broken terrain, flamethrowers licked flames across wooden stakes and obstacles, and bridges were constructed in moments where once there had been barricades. Every action the Germans attempted was countered before it could even begin. From the cliffs, artillery observers shouted corrections, but ammunition was critically low. Shells had to be rationed, each one precious, yet useless against the overwhelming numbers approaching. Sao fired in bursts, watching as each bullet struck targets that would vanish in seconds under the tide of reinforcements. It was a war of attrition on a scale no one had prepared for. Courage and skill were swallowed whole by the relentless mathematics of modern war. The 21st Panzer Division's counterattacks continued, but each attempt was met with blinding fire. Flare-lit nightfalls revealed German movements to Allied ships and aircraft, turning the battlefield into an illuminated trap. Tanks were destroyed before reaching the sand. Infantry units were picked off as they advanced. The soldiers' morale was collapsing under the weight of an enemy who could replace losses faster than the Germans could even count them. Sao's mind drifted to the crumpled letter from Metzingen. He pulled it from his pocket for a fleeting second, eyes scanning the familiar handwriting, a tether to a life that seemed impossibly distant. The words offered a cruel contrast to the horrors around him. Hope had been reduced to paper, bravery reduced to bullets, and survival had become a fight against inevitability. By evening, the psychological toll was evident. Material shock had evolved into despair. Men froze mid-step, firing at shadows, hallucinating movement in the smoke, or weeping in silence. The Atlantic Wall was no longer a defensive line. It was a monument to the futility of human arrogance against overwhelming industrial power. Concrete and steel had failed, but the spirit of men was being tested far beyond endurance. Sao's bunker became a small island of resistance amid the chaos. He moved with grim determination, reloading, aiming, firing. The MG-42, now almost an extension of his body, spat death into the advancing waves. Each trigger squeeze was both defiance and surrender, a refusal to yield even as the battle proved hopeless. Every glance toward the horizon reminded him of the tidal wave of production and organization that had reduced years of training, experience, and preparation to dust. Night began to creep over Omaha Beach, shadows lengthening over wrecked landing craft and smoking obstacles. Yet the Americans did not stop. Reinforcements poured in, bridging tanks, engineers, infantry, and artillery. Every attempt to regroup, every small tactical advantage the Germans tried to seize was instantly nullified by the overwhelming force of the Allies. The soldiers had become pawns in a battle where production and coordination mattered more than valor or discipline. Sao's hands ached, his ears rang from the constant thunder of guns, and his eyes burned from smoke and dust. Yet he stayed vigilant, the MG-42 his lifeline and his weapon, a witness to the relentless unfolding of industrialized war. He understood now that courage alone was powerless against the machinery of modern warfare. Omaha Beach was not just a battlefield, it was a crucible of reality, a brutal lesson that nations with limitless production and logistical mastery could crush even the bravest defenders. By the time darkness fully settled, German positions were fractured beyond repair. The Atlantic Wall, the bunkers, the concrete fortifications, all were shadows of what had been imagined. Sao's bunker, scarred and battered, was a testament not to heroism, but to endurance amid impossible odds. The night would bring no rest, only the promise of continued struggle against a force that would not relent.
2100 hours. Darkness had fully swallowed Omaha Beach, but the chaos did not abate. Heinrich So's bunker now felt like a tomb, shadows dancing across cracked concrete as distant flares and artillery fire lit the beach intermittently. The MG-42 in his hands had become an extension of himself, firing in bursts that barely dented the relentless tide advancing across the sand.
The Atlantic Wall was crumbling, and the soldiers within it were beginning to realize that survival was as much a battle of the mind as it was of bullets. So could hear the cries of men, distant and near, echoing across the beach. Each explosion, each gunshot, carried the weight of despair. The first American footholds were now fully established, and the tide of reinforcements never ceased. Tanks, flamethrowers, bridging equipment, and infantry units moved with industrial precision, turning the beach into a machine of destruction that the Germans could not hope to stop. Every defensive calculation had been rendered irrelevant by overwhelming numbers and logistical superiority. German commanders attempted to coordinate counterattacks, but communication lines had been severed, radios jammed, and paratroopers behind their lines created confusion and terror. Every movement was observed, every attempt neutralized. Material shock was now compounded by psychological collapse. Soldiers fired at shadows, some weeping, others laughing with the madness creeping in. The Atlantic Wall, once a symbol of German might, had become a monument to human hubris against a force that could replace losses faster than they could inflict them. So's thoughts drifted again to Metzingen, to the letter tucked in his pocket. The words, once a tether to hope, now felt like a relic from another life. The promise of waiting and reunion was drowned beneath the tidal wave of industrialized war. Courage, skill, and discipline were no longer enough. Survival depended on endurance, instinct, and the grim acceptance of inevitability. By late evening, the German positions were fractured and scattered. Bunkers had been destroyed, obstacles cleared, and ammunition was nearly depleted. Yet So and a few others continued to fire, each burst a desperate defiance against a force that had long since surpassed anything they had been trained to resist. The beach had become a crucible, testing every human limit, where bravery was consumed by sheer numbers and relentless coordination. American engineers and infantry worked methodically to consolidate positions, constructing makeshift bridges, clearing mines, and connecting footholds. Tanks advanced, flares illuminated every movement, and artillery fire suppressed any attempt at organized German response. The defenders were trapped in a nightmare, forced to react to a tide that moved faster than orders could travel. So's bunker, scarred and battered, was now a symbol of endurance amidst futility. He fired until his arms ached, his vision blurred, and every nerve screamed for rest. The MG-42 roared, a lifeline and a testament to defiance, even as the strategic reality became undeniable. The battle was lost, and the war, in this sector at least, was slipping from their grasp. The night air was thick with smoke, salt, and the stench of battle. Every sound, explosions, gunfire, screams, reminded So and the remaining defenders of the overwhelming force arrayed against them. The Atlantic Wall, once a calculated fortress, was now a shattered dream. Every step, every shot, every heartbeat was measured against an enemy whose production, coordination, and logistics far outmatched anything the Germans could muster. So rested for a brief moment, listening to the chaos outside. The beach had become a testament to the industrial power of the Allies, a brutal reminder that modern warfare was no longer a contest of individual bravery, but of production, logistics, and relentless pressure. As So looked at the horizon, So understood the grim truth. Omaha Beach was not just a battlefield, it was a demonstration of the future of warfare, and the German defenders were powerless to stop it.
0300 hours. The beach was cloaked in darkness, yet Omaha's inferno did not cease. Heinrich Sau's bunker had become an island amid chaos, a fragmented outpost amid a sea of relentless movement. Through cracks in the concrete, he watched shadows of soldiers crawling forward, tanks glinting under sporadic flares, and landing craft still shoving ashore, waves of reinforcements seemingly endless. Every defensive plan, every strategic calculation, every ounce of German confidence had been shattered by sheer Allied resolve. Sau's MG-42 had become part of him, firing in mechanical bursts, each round a defiant scream against an assault that had long since exceeded imagination. Around him, the few remaining men of his unit were frozen in a trance-like state, eyes wide, breathing ragged, haunted by the horror unfolding. Material shock had escalated into full psychological collapse. Soldiers fired at shadows, at flares, at anything that moved, sometimes even at each other, confusion and fear consuming rational thought. Behind the lines, German officers struggled to regain control. Communication was fragmented, supply lines destroyed, and reinforcements paralyzed by relentless Allied air superiority. Paratroopers had cut routes, sabotaged equipment, and sown terror. Every attempt at counteraction was neutralized almost before it began. The Atlantic Wall, once a symbol of strength and invincibility, had become a monument to miscalculation, a testament to the overwhelming force of production, coordination, and industrialized warfare. Sau's thoughts flickered to the crumpled letter from Metzingen. He fingered it briefly, a lifeline to a world that now seemed impossibly distant. Words of love and promise felt cruel against the backdrop of this mechanical slaughterhouse. Courage and skill, once the pillars of survival, were now irrelevant against an enemy who replaced losses faster than they could be inflicted. Every heartbeat, every breath, every round fired was a struggle against inevitability. By early morning, the German positions were fractured. Bunkers had been destroyed, artillery silenced, obstacles cleared. Yet Sau and a few remaining soldiers continued to fight, their resistance now more symbolic than strategic. The beach had become a theater where human bravery clashed against industrial inevitability. Specialized Allied armor, bridging units, flamethrowers, and infantry moved in flawless coordination, dismantling defenses piece by piece. The 21st Panzer Division made desperate attempts to counterattack, but their armor and infantry were met with calculated fire. Flares illuminated every move, naval guns suppressed any concentrated effort. Tanks were destroyed before reaching the beach. Artillery positions that survived the initial bombardment were quickly neutralized. German soldiers were left scrambling, isolated and exhausted, their morale crumbling under the relentless tide of industrialized warfare.
Sau's bunker became a microcosm of the wider disaster. He fired until his arms ached and vision blurred. He watched comrades fall beside him, some dead, some screaming, some frozen in shock. The Atlantic Wall was gone, replaced by smoke, fire, and the relentless advance of men and machines. Each volley from the MG-42 was both defiance and surrender, a desperate attempt to assert control over chaos that had long surpassed human limits. By dawn, Sau understood fully the reality of the battle. Omaha Beach was no longer about tactics, courage, or strategy. It was about endurance, resilience, and witnessing the overwhelming force of production and coordination. The Allied machine had proven unstoppable, and the German defenders were powerless to alter the course. Concrete, steel, and discipline had failed. Human endurance alone could not hold back a tide engineered for dominance. Sau's mind raced as he considered the future. The lessons of D-Day were clear. Modern warfare was no longer won by heroism alone, but by logistics, industry, and relentless pressure. Omaha Beach was a crucible of this reality. Soldiers like Sau had fought with skill, courage, and desperation, but against a tide that replaced losses instantly, their efforts were ultimately futile. The Atlantic Wall had fallen, and with it the illusion of invincibility. As the sun rose, faintly illuminating the beach, Sau prepared for another round, another wave of assault. The MG-42 was still hot in his hands, the bunker scarred and battered, yet his resolve, though tested to the edge of human endurance, remained. He knew survival was a fleeting victory.
The true lesson of Omaha Beach was not in individual bravery, but in witnessing the inexorable machine of industrialized war, a force that no bunker, no calculation, and no human courage could fully resist. 0060 hours. Dawn broke over Omaha Beach, casting a pale light on a landscape transformed into a tableau of ruin. Heinrich Seo's bunker, once a calculated stronghold, now resembled a scarred relic, walls pockmarked with shrapnel and smoke lingering in every corner. The MG-42 rested in his hands, hot from hours of continuous firing, each burst echoing the relentless chaos beyond the concrete. The Atlantic Wall, which had promised invincibility, now groaned under the weight of an unstoppable assault. Seo peered through the shattered embrasures, his eyes catching the glint of approaching tanks and infantry. The Americans advanced with machine-like precision, overcoming mines, obstacles, and barricades as if the beach itself had been designed for their passage. The German defenses, painstakingly constructed over years, were being erased in hours. Every plan, every calculation, every ounce of skill was being rendered irrelevant by the sheer scale and coordination of the Allied machine. Around him, the few remaining men of his unit were exhausted, some firing at shadows, others crouched in silent terror, haunted by the carnage surrounding them. Material shock had now become psychological collapse. Orders from higher command were sporadic, confused, or delayed. Attempts at coordination were futile. Communication lines were severed, and the paratroopers behind their positions cut supply routes and sowed chaos. The Atlantic Wall had become less a defense and more a monument to miscalculation and hubris. Seo's mind drifted to Metzingen again, to the crumpled letter in his pocket. Words of love and promise seemed almost cruel against the backdrop of relentless destruction. Courage, skill, and training were no longer sufficient. Survival depended on endurance and the grim understanding that the Allies' industrial might could replace losses faster than any German soldier could inflict them. Each breath, each heartbeat, each shot was a battle against inevitability. By mid-morning, the beach was a storm of fire, smoke, and relentless movement. American engineers laid bridges, cleared obstacles, and established supply lines. Tanks, flamethrowers, and infantry units moved with terrifying efficiency, dismantling defenses one by one. German counterattacks were sporadic and disorganized, easily suppressed by flares and naval gunfire. Every attempt to regroup or resist was nullified by the overwhelming tide of mechanized, coordinated force. Seo's bunker became a microcosm of the broader disaster. He fired until his arms trembled, watching comrades fall beside him, some screaming, some silent, some frozen in disbelief. The Atlantic Wall, the concrete fortifications, the carefully calculated fields of fire, all were irrelevant in the face of industrialized warfare. Human bravery, once the cornerstone of combat, was swallowed by the sheer scale and coordination of the enemy. The 21st Panzer Division's armored units attempted to advance, but flares illuminated every move, and naval and air bombardment tore through formations. Tanks were destroyed before reaching the beach, and infantry units were decimated under relentless fire. The defenders were isolated, exhausted, and outmatched. The psychological impact was total. Fear, fatigue, and disbelief replaced discipline, turning once organized units into fragmented pockets of resistance. Seo fired his MG-42 until his vision blurred, arms screaming, yet he did not stop. Each round was both defiance and acknowledgement of futility. The beach was no longer a battleground of skill and bravery. It was a demonstration of industrial war, where numbers, logistics, and coordination mattered more than individual heroism. Every wave of American soldiers, every tank, every artillery shell reinforced the harsh reality. The German defenders were outmatched in every possible measure.
By late afternoon, the few remaining German soldiers understood the scale of their defeat. Supply lines were destroyed, communication was impossible, and reserves could not reach the front. Seo and the others were clinging to survival, firing at any movement, witnessing a relentless enemy whose industrial might and tactical coordination made resistance almost meaningless. Omaha Beach had become a crucible, testing the limits of human endurance against the overwhelming machinery of modern warfare. Seo's bunker, scarred and battered, stood as a witness to the collapse of strategy, morale, and the illusion of invincibility. The lessons of D-Day were clear. Modern war was won not by bravery alone, but by logistics, production, and relentless execution. The Atlantic Wall had fallen, and the survivors, if they endured, would carry the psychological scars of a battle where courage was consumed by industrial might.
1,200 hours. The sun had climbed high, casting a harsh, almost indifferent light over Omaha Beach. Hinrich Saw's bunker, once a place of calculated defense, now stood battered and scarred, walls etched with cracks and soot. The MG-42 rested in his hands, each burst of fire a desperate attempt to assert some control over a battlefield that had long since escaped human calculation. The Atlantic Wall, a symbol of supposed invincibility, had crumbled under the relentless pressure of industrialized warfare. Saw's eyes scanned the horizon. American infantry had firmly established multiple footholds, while tanks rumbled across broken terrain, bridging units cleared obstacles with mechanical precision, and engineers consolidated positions. Every defensive calculation, every prepared field of fire, every ounce of German courage was being swept aside by sheer logistical and tactical superiority. The beach had become a machine, a moving nightmare of men, machines, and relentless motion. Around him, the remaining men of his unit were exhausted, firepower almost spent, eyes haunted, breathing ragged. Material shock had morphed into full psychological collapse. Orders were sporadic, often impossible to follow, and communication was fractured. Paratroopers behind their positions continued to harass and cut supply lines. The Atlantic Wall was no longer a line of defense. It was a testament to hubris, a relic of strategy and confidence that had been dismantled piece by piece. Saw thought again of Metzingen, the crumpled letter tucked in his pocket. Words of love and promise seemed cruel against the backdrop of relentless destruction. Courage, skill, and preparation were meaningless against an enemy who could replace losses faster than they could be inflicted. Each round fired, each breath taken, each heartbeat was a struggle against inevitability. Survival was now the only metric that mattered, and even that seemed tenuous. By mid-afternoon, the beach had transformed into a chaotic tableau of fire, smoke, and relentless forward motion. Specialized Allied armor advanced with mechanical precision, clearing mines, obstacles, and defenses. Infantry followed with tireless efficiency. German counterattacks were sporadic, uncoordinated, and easily suppressed by the overwhelming firepower and coordination of the Allies. Every attempt to regroup or resist was instantly neutralized. Saw's bunker was a microcosm of the broader disaster. He fired until his arms ached, watching comrades fall beside him. The Atlantic Wall, the concrete fortifications, the obstacles, they were all irrelevant. Bravery, skill, and experience were swallowed by sheer scale and efficiency. The battle was no longer one of tactics or courage. It was industrialized, relentless, and merciless. The 21st Panzer Division attempted another armored advance, but flares and naval gunfire illuminated every movement. Tanks were destroyed before reaching the sand, and infantry units were decimated under concentrated fire. German defenders were isolated, exhausted, and overwhelmed. The psychological toll was total. Fear, disbelief, and fatigue replaced discipline, reducing units to fragmented pockets of resistance. Saw fired relentlessly, each burst of the MG-42 both defiance and acknowledgement of futility.
The beach was not a battlefield of heroism anymore. It was a demonstration of industrialized warfare, where logistics, production, and coordination mattered more than individual skill. Every wave of American soldiers, every tank, every artillery strike reinforced the impossibility of victory for the German defenders. By evening, the few remaining German soldiers understood the magnitude of their defeat. Supply lines destroyed, communication gone, and reserves unable to reach the front, they were clinging to survival. Saw's bunker, scarred and battered, remained a testament not to victory, but to endurance amidst futility. Omaha Beach had become a crucible, testing the limits of human courage against an enemy whose industrial and tactical superiority made resistance almost meaningless. The lessons of D-Day were clear. In modern warfare, industrial might and coordination outmatched bravery and skill. The Atlantic Wall had fallen, and the survivors, if they endured, would carry the psychological scars of a battle where courage was consumed by a machine of relentless efficiency. Saw's eyes, burning with exhaustion, reflected the harsh truth. Omaha Beach was not just a battlefield, it was a revelation of how modern war was waged and won.
1,800 hours. The sun was low, casting long, harsh shadows over Omaha Beach. Heinrich Sau's bunker, battered and scorched, stood as a silent witness to the relentless march of history. The MG-42 in his hands was still hot, its recoil burning his arms, but the rhythm of firing had slowed. Around him, the few surviving men of his unit huddled, haunted and exhausted, eyes reflecting the horror they had endured. The Atlantic Wall had crumbled. The illusions of German invincibility lay in ruins across the sand, concrete, and smoke. Sau looked out across the beach. The Americans had not stopped. Waves of reinforcements, tanks, engineers, and infantry continued their advance with relentless efficiency. Every bunker that had resisted the initial bombardment was now destroyed or abandoned. Obstacles that had once seemed insurmountable were cleared with mechanical precision. The German defenders were broken, isolated, and psychologically shattered. Courage and skill had been tested to their limits and found insufficient against an enemy whose industrial might replaced losses almost instantly. By evening, the full scope of the disaster became clear. The 21st Panzer Division's armored units had been decimated. Communication lines were destroyed, supply routes obliterated. German officers struggled to maintain order, but units were fragmented, morale destroyed. The psychological toll was complete. Soldiers fired at shadows, at flares, even at each other. Survival had become a desperate, fleeting hope, and the Atlantic Wall, once a symbol of strategic calculation, was a shattered relic. Sau's mind wandered back to Metzingen, to the crumpled letter in his pocket. The words that once offered hope now felt cruelly distant. The promise of reunion, love, and normalcy seemed impossible against the backdrop of this mechanical slaughterhouse. Courage, discipline, and training had failed to match the inexhaustible power of the Allied machine. The beach was no longer a battleground, it was a brutal lesson in the mathematics of modern war. American forces continued to pour ashore. Artillery, flamethrowers, bridging units, and infantry moved with unerring precision. Paratroopers behind German lines cut routes and communication, further isolating the defenders. Every attempt at resistance was nullified. Every tactical maneuver had been anticipated, suppressed, or destroyed. The Atlantic Wall had not fallen in a day. It had been consumed by an industrial machine, fueled by endless resources, logistics, and coordination beyond German comprehension. Sau fired one last time, his vision blurred, arms trembling, ears ringing from the constant roar of battle. Each pull of the trigger was both defiance and surrender.
The bunkers, the concrete, the calculated fields of fire, they were all meaningless against the overwhelming tide of men and machines. Omaha Beach had become a crucible, testing endurance and revealing the limitations of human bravery when confronted by industrial might. As night fell, the survivors took stock. The Atlantic Wall was gone. Bunkers were empty or destroyed. German forces were fractured and demoralized. The few who remained understood that this battle was not about courage or skill. It was about logistics, production, and the relentless application of overwhelming force. Sau's experience embodied this brutal lesson. Courage had been expended, skill tested, and strategy reduced to dust, while the enemy's industrial and organizational supremacy had carried the day. In the aftermath, Sau and other survivors faced the grim reality. They had been witnesses to history's most brutal demonstration of industrialized warfare. Omaha Beach had shown that modern combat was won not by the bravest soldiers, but by the societies capable of producing the most material, coordinating the most effectively, and applying relentless pressure. Germany had fought valiantly, but against a machine fueled by endless resources, bravery alone was insufficient. Heinrich Sau lowered his MG-42, exhausted and scarred. Around him, Omaha Beach lay in ruins, but the lesson was clear. Modern war belonged to those who could combine courage with industrial power. Human bravery had been tested to the limit and failed to stem the tide. The Atlantic Wall was broken, German morale shattered, and the Allies had proven that victory was a product of production, planning, and relentless execution. The invasion they had promised to throw back into the sea had instead swept them away, carrying with it the final illusions of German dominance.